Sure, I'm not the first person to see synergies between Christian peacemaking and caring for creation. But as I go through this, I'm going to be explaining what I see are some of the synergies and leaving you perhaps to see some of the other possibilities as well. And maybe there are some actual conflicts between the two, but at the moment I'm focusing on the common ground. Well, I think most people would agree that, that in the modern era, the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was a wake-up call to the world, and particularly to Christians, to become more active in peacemaking. It's very sad, isn't it, that Nagasaki, which was taken out August 1945, was a centre for Roman Catholics in Japan. And so we had a Christian nation fighting against other Christians. And I just puzzle how that can ever be right. If the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was a wake-up call for Christians to become more active in peacemaking, then perhaps the equivalent in the environmental sphere would have been the Apollo program, and particularly the Earthrise images, which came back on Christmas Eve 1968. And it's interesting, isn't it, that this whole space program was a game of one-upmanship between the United States and the Soviet Union, with a strong military component. And yet somehow that's brought about a realization of how fragile and vulnerable we are as a planet and as a human population. And when we talk now about saving the planet, I think a lot of it really is how can we save ourselves from the mess that we've created. Well, the Earth is a marvel, isn't it, really, when you think about it? This ball of mostly water floating there in space, just a comfortable distance away from the sun. And we have a moon which produces daily tides that promote the well-being of life in the oceans, cleaning the beaches, and sustaining human life in many ways as well through providing food. About 10 years ago, a Christian C&D pointed out that it would just take a discharge of Trident nuclear weapons to create enough dust and dirt thrown up into the atmosphere to produce what they called a global nuclear winter. And the Earth would be shrouded in dust and fallout for a long time, who knows, maybe a year or two, during which time crops would fail and there would be mass starvation and environmental destruction. This isn't actually a crater from a nuclear weapon. This is an asteroid impact in Arizona. But it gives an impression of the sort of situation we might be in with even a modest discharge of nuclear weapons. And whilst we as Christians are concerned about caring for creation and the big focus on climate change, which is gradually, well, rapidly creeping up on us, in the space of just a few hours, we have the capacity now to destroy much of life on Earth. Of course, there are disputes going on in the background about whether climate change is the extent to which it's caused by human beings and how much it's to do with natural cycles, and I aren't competent enough to go into that. And there are disputes as well over nuclear weapons. Some would say it's the best thing since sliced bread. It's kept the peace all these years, 75 years. And I think as Christians, we need to be careful not to dig into one particular view or the other, but to derive our motivation and inspiration from Christian teaching. And I particularly have been thinking more lately about the creed and the incarnation and the end times, now Jesus promises to return, and which gives us hope. But if we're realistic about the planet and we take science seriously, then we have to realize, I guess, that there have been mass extinctions over the past 4.5 billion years. This is a puzzle to us, isn't it, really? How can a creator God allow these things to happen? Perhaps another way of looking at it would be to say, well, isn't it marvelous that human life has reached this point of consciousness with the Creator? And we should just be thankful and trust that God is going to work out our future for the best possible outcome. We have actually reached a new era in terms of geological formation, and it's known as the Anthropocene. And what's happened since the testing of atomic weapons over the last 70 years, particularly up to about the early 90s, so much radiation has been released into the Earth's atmosphere that it's traceable across the whole surface of the Earth. And added to that, here, by the way, are some pictures of the nations and where they've been exploding their weapons, mostly above ground, then towards the end of that period, underground. But the other thing that's noticeable across the surface of the Earth, including the ocean floor, is of course microplastics. Not always microplastics, whole rafts of plastic that are caught up and swirling around the oceans. And so human beings have made a lasting impact on the planet. And this is something that will be there forever, as far as we know. Nuclear energy is a bit of a mixed blessing. I know that many people regard it as the way forward, but I'm struck by the fact that this radioactivity from plutonium in particular lasts for such a long time. Obviously, if the Egyptians, the ancient Egyptians, had been using nuclear technology, we'd still now be trying to keep it safe from escaping into watercourses and from terrorists getting hold of it. And that's the sort of legacy that we're bestowing on future generations. Our scientists have had 75 years to find a solution to this problem and still haven't come up with one. But of course, the real problem we have these days is our consumption of fossil fuels and consumer lifestyles, which are putting such a tremendous strain on the earth. But another way of looking at this, perhaps controversial, is that human populations would never have flourished and expanded to the extent that they have without fossil fuels. We'd still be living in a sort of society that is based very much on hierarchy and slavery to support the privileged elite. But we only just have to look around the world to see what oil refineries are doing, the coal mining, it's taking off the mountaintops in the Appalachians. You may remember the Gulf War and those terrible fires that were set off by Saddam Hussein. We've got the Canada oil tar reserves, which are being exploited now, and an area the size of England has been turned into something resembling the surface of the moon. And of course, every so often we have a big nuclear incident, and that's a picture there of Chernobyl, which has now been successfully encased in a shroud. Alongside our concerns about man-made climate change, the consumer society that we're very much a part of is threatening the boundaries with the natural world, and many species of animals, plants and insects are at the point extinction. It's very sad and sobering, and I'm sure everybody on this call and more besides are worrying about this. When you think of the good that we could do with our national budgets, it's sad. It's more than sad. It's idolatrous, really. I would say that so much of military spend, so much of national budgets goes on military spending. And I say this as a US citizen. I was born over there, and I'm a bit ashamed, really, that the country that I owe loyalty to spends so much more than any other country in the world on weaponry. And it's so deeply embedded in the political, the business, the news media that it's very hard to see how this is ever going to change. I was struck by this quotation from Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who I'm sure Martin Davis and others will have heard of and respect. And this was a statement towards the end of his life. The day is not far distant when humanity will realize that biologically it is faced with a choice between suicide and adoration. And when we think of adoration, we really could expand that a bit to mean worship. And for us as Christians, we obviously recognize Jesus Christ as the one to whom we give our time and attention, the one to whom we devote our lives. Well, we must also be thankful, I think, for the activities of environmentalists who in recent years have raised the profile on our responsibilities. I don't agree with everything that Greta said, but she's obviously got this whole caring for creation thing on the agenda. And here in Gloucestershire, we have our own movement, which has become a global phenomena, the Extinction Rebellion people, and Dr. Gail Mary Bradbrook, hailing from Stroud. I've never met her yet, but it would be interesting if we could have a Christian dialogue with her. And I know that many of you on this call are members of Extinction Rebellion, and certainly respect that. Going back to the military situation, which is always preying on my mind, there was a recent study from Brown's University in the US, which estimated that the United States Department of Defense has a larger annual carbon footprint than most countries on the earth. You only just have to look across Europe and Asia to see a selection of the bases which are there for our safety. I'm sure that's how it's very well meaning, but it would be good if there could be some way of reducing that carbon footprint and turning swords into plowshares. Well, as you know, Greta and ER and many others claim that the science is settled, which means really that we are guilty since the Industrial Revolution of causing potentially catastrophic climate change, and many people are seeing evidence of that around us even today. And sadly, those who are suffering at the moment more than anywhere else are in the developing countries where they're only just getting by as it is. What puzzles me is how can we as Christians make a distinctive contribution? And during the Cold War, I was very much involved with a peace prayer group at St Thomas Crux in Sheffield. I'd love to see something like that starting up again. And I'm very pleased that Martin Davis and others are meeting regularly to pray about the climate crisis. Another distinctive way that we might work together is this example here from Holy Week 2019, when several of us made a kind of peace vigil stroke protest outside the incinerator at Javelin Park, just down the road from here. I thought it was great how Peter at the back there chatted to the manager of the plant while the rest of us were praying. To exchange views, to differ, must be the right way forward rather than digging in and throwing rocks at one another or whatever the equivalent might be. You may be aware that the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists has recently moved forward the hands of the doomsday clock, as it's called, and it's now, it used to be at 2 minutes to midnight for a long time, representing various threats to humanity. And at the start of the year, it was moved forward to 900 seconds to midnight. And this is just obviously an illustration, but it shows that we are, I think, in a situation where science is confirming what the Bible has said for a long time, that we are to anticipate the last days. And in some ways, when you think of geological time, we are in the last days of the last days. Nobody knows for sure what is going to happen physically and socially and in terms of other species on the planet. But the Christian creed, the Apostles' Creed, Nicene Creed, give us confidence that Christ will come again in glory. But that doesn't mean to say we trash the planet along the way, just the opposite. We want Christ to return to a planet that is being well cared for. I'm sure all of us would agree with that. And as a Christian, I've often thought about all this just from a scientific point of view. I spent 30 years working on environmental issues for a multinational. But then I was brought up short when I read these few words from Gus Sabeth, a US environmental lawyer and former Dean of Forestry at Yale. And this is what he said: I used to think that the top environmental problems facing the world were global warming, environmental degradation, and ecosystem collapse, and that we scientists could fix these problems. But I was wrong. The real problem is not these three items, but greed, selfishness, and apathy. And for that, we need a spiritual and cultural transformation. Added to that, I read something the other day which impressed me, which is that here in the Western world, we are spiritually poor. We're starving. And the way we try to compensate for that is through consumerism. And that's just linked in, I think, with the annual Christian gathering, Greenbelt. We're coming out of that a few years ago, and I'm sure Jerry and Sue Barr will remember this. There was a spirit of generosity that emerged. And I think that's something we would love to encourage again. Well, going back to this theme of how can we make a distinctively Christian contribution, there are differences between us. For example, the Dean of Westminster Abbey at the time, back in, I think it was March 2019, held a service to give thanks to God for, was it 50 years of nuclear submarines? However, some of us, a minority, took the opposite view that a Christian church was not the place to be celebrating weapons of mass destruction. So that brings me on to a proposal, and it's not very well developed at all, but when I look at the success of the Eco Church Award scheme in the past 3 or 4 years, with over 2,000 churches signed up to this, I wonder if we could come up with a similar scheme of peacemaking, and perhaps take some of the same headings that Eco Church has used. You'll be familiar with this whole area of worship and teaching. I wonder if we could have worship and teaching that celebrated certain key dates each year in the church's calendar. And surely the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is something that we should mark with a sense of lament. And when we get to October, as we are at the moment, maybe we should be thanking God from the bottom of our hearts that the Cuban Missile Crisis was solved without an exchange. I give thanks to God for the closure of the Greenham Common Air Base when cruise and Pershing missiles were stationed there. I give thanks for the talks between Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev back in 1986 in Iceland that led to the SALT II agreement. And then in November, the fall of the Berlin Wall. Surely we should be thankful that the Russian people were able to let go of their identity with communism and rediscover their Christian heritage, albeit orthodox and somewhat different to our own. Well, moving on to buildings, I just don't know how that would link in with peacemaking at the moment, but if anybody's got any bright ideas, please let me know. Land, again, I don't know. Maybe the church has got land that could be turned over for peacemaking purposes. I just don't know. But if anybody's got any ideas, please speak up. Community and global engagement is the next area in the Eco Church Award scheme. I'm just thinking, well, one quick way for churches to get involved at community and global level is through joining a local peace group. And there are branches all around the country of Christian CND and the Anglican Pacifist Fellowship. By the way, the word pacifist is under review at the moment, and there's a move to change the name to the Anglican Peacemaking Fellowship. Lifestyle is the fifth area. I think this is where the rubber hits the road, so to speak, because we can all go to seminars on environment and such like, but what difference is it going to make to us personally? And I think this is where we have to look at what we can do closer to home. Obviously, we come at this from Christians, not all in the Church of England. I just put that up there as an example. But what are we doing to care for those and support organisations which care for women and children who are suffering domestic violence? What are we doing to support Garas and other agencies that are caring for refugees and asylum seekers, many of them displaced not only by environmental, but also our adventurous war games in different parts of the world? There's a Citizens Advice Bureau which provides free legal advice to people in need. Maybe some of us could be part of the Neighbourhood Watch. If you've got counselling gifts, why not join the Christian counselling service known as Listening Post? And then there's Christians Against Poverty. So the way I see it, Christian peacemaking has a very big agenda and is something that has been rather neglected, particularly in the last few years. People have the illusion that we are now living in some form of peace, but many of the nuclear weapons are still there and capable of taking out the whole global population in a matter of hours. So I would encourage us to work together and see what we can do with any spare capacity we have to improve these synergies between peacemaking and caring for God's creation. Thank you.